session dealing with church planting, missions models, and scripture. So what I want to do is remind you of the different models that we talked about the last time we were here, and then I'd like us to pick back up where we left off last time. So we talked about, first of all, churches establishing churches. Basically, a church that is healthy is able to send out individuals to, it could be they send out a team of people who, one of them is going to be a pastor, some of them might be Sunday school teachers, people who are helping out with the church getting started. In fact, we had a couple years ago a family in our church who moved out to Utah, and they were moving out to be a part of a church planting team, and that team had a lot of people in it, and it helped the church get established very quickly. And if you're going to reach your community, you got to be a healthy church. I mean, it's just very, very simple. So churches planting churches was the first model we looked at. The second was churches that establish satellite churches, and the idea is that rather than the church desiring to start independent churches, the church is desiring to establish, you could say, a network that is under one head, and kind of an Episcopalian model, Anglican type model, though you don't think of megachurches being Episcopalian churches, typically speaking. But the idea is you have a massive church membership, you have one pastor, a group of pastors who are kind of like in charge, and then you have all these secondary churches that are under the main hub. The third model we looked at was replanting a church, and the idea is that you have land, you have a building, you have money in the bank, and you have 4 people. And those 4 people are like, we're going to close our doors if we don't have some help, if somebody doesn't come in. And in that situation, someone comes in like a church planter. However, they aren't starting in a storefront, they're not renting, they have land, they have a building, and they have a constitution and bylaws, and the church is basically being restarted, and they're doing that as a team. This is something that is very, very needed in some parts of the country, out in the West Coast, out in New England, where there have been old historic churches and congregations there for 150 years, and now it's just a couple people meeting in those places. In the UK, this is very, very common as well. Struggling churches that decide to merge to form a new church. So you may have this church over here and this church over here, and ironically, sometimes what ends up happening is in a community where there's a healthy church, during that church's healthy days, they're starting other churches, and those churches are growing and thriving, and then 50 years later, some of those churches start shutting their doors. They have a common history because they were started out of the same church, or maybe they're started with the same missionary or church planter or whatever it was. But now these churches are at the point where they really cannot continue to function in a healthy way, independent. And so they merge together as one church, they pick one location, and they try to become a stronger church through that. And this can work, but there are also challenges that can be associated with that. They need to be like-minded. It's not good when you have one church that kind of sucks the other one in, takes over their property, whatever. Definitely can happen. And so we talked a little bit about that. And then organization starting or replanting churches, where the authority is not really on the local church level, but it's on a board level, and it's an organization that's sending out church planters. Sometimes they own the land. Sometimes they're paying the salaries of those church planters. And if it stays like that indefinitely, it can be a very, very dangerous thing. So that is another thing that is common. All right, well, from there, we got into 3 questions that we wanted to discuss. And I thought that they were important for us to flesh out, so we spent a good bit of time with that. The first one was, what is your church's polity? And when we say polity, what we mean is, what is the organizational structure of the congregation? Is it an Anglican structure where you have a denominational hierarchy with pastors under the authority of a bishop over a region, over an area? By the way, Episcopalians or Anglicans are like this. Methodists, same thing. Sometimes Anabaptist type churches like Mennonites will be structured sort of similar to this, where they have a bit of an Anglican model.
Are Lutherans that way too?
Huh?
Are
Lutherans, absolutely. Some Presbyterians. The second would be Baptist, where you have a pastor, sometimes called an elder, or pastors and elders, who provide spiritual oversight, but they make decisions with congregation's involvement. So what we would say at a Baptist church that's truly Baptist polity is that the church is congregational, in the sense that there's leadership from those who are ordained, qualified to be pastors, but the congregation votes on the decisions that are being made. Then you had the Presbyterian model, where the elders are the ones who make the decisions, and the congregation affirms their decisions, but really doesn't make them. So the elders say, this is what we're going to do. Hope you guys like this. It's actually not going to be quite that callous, probably, but it could be. Depends on the church. But the idea is that the congregation sort of isn't involved in decision making. It's with a group of men who are elders. And then lastly, the dictatorship, where, and a lot of Baptist churches, frankly, are dictatorships where the congregation doesn't do business meetings, or they do business meetings that are not really truly business meetings. And a lot of times, it's like a situation where a guy has planted a church when he's pretty young, and the church is kind of built around that guy's personality as he matures and grows. His perspective and how he handles things is just inherently trusted by the people, and that's how that dictatorship often develops. Second question is your congregation truly independent? And we asked, do they receive outside financial support? Do they support their pastor? Now, someone could be bivocational, but the church is not receiving funds from outside to support their pastor, so he works a job, but he also is paid a salary. And between the church, what the church can do and what he does in his work, he feels that he can balance ministry. The church agrees that he can do this, and it'll be like that. Or sometimes you have guys who are a part of a pastoral team, and some of them are full-time and some of them are part-time. Some of them are they're part of the staff, but they're working a secular job 100%. So there's different situations. But the question is, are you being dependent on outside support or not? I was in a board meeting today. I'm on the rescue mission board, and we had a discussion about financial support in relation to the government. And there are some bills that are going through right now in Maryland, the Maryland legislature, that are going to try to regulate places like rescue missions. And we kind of discussed the situation, what we know is in the bills, how we're structured. And one of the things that was a big discussion point was, it's a good thing we don't take money from the government, because as soon as you do, you become dependent, and you say, well, we can't in good conscience do this. And they say, well, then you lose your funding. And all of a sudden people go, what do we do? Because if we lose our funding, we can't function. What do we do? That's why it's so dangerous to do that. So the point is that if your congregation is dependent on outside funds, it's not truly independent. And then how do they make decisions? Do they actually have business meetings where they discuss church business and they actually work through things and they make decisions, and they're not considering the influence of an outside group before they make this decision? They are really looking at it internally based on biblical conviction within the congregation itself. And the third question we got into was, how do the scriptures teach us to conduct church business? So last week we talked about the appointment of those who are in ministry roles. What we mean by ministry roles is those who are pastors, and when the Bible talks about pastors, the most common term is elder, and also the term overseer or bishop. And so those terms, pastor, elder, and bishop or overseer, are all describing the same office with different functions of that office. So some are emphasizing the oversight side. Some are emphasizing the maturity and the leadership side. Some are emphasizing the pastoral side, where you're caring for a congregation. That's what they do. So in order for a person to be appointed to that office, there needs to be some kind of process that determines how they do it. So if a church has a pastor who basically goes to the congregation, he says, I'm retiring and I've decided that that's going to be the next guy, that tells you something about the church's polity. That's a dictatorship, okay? Or if the church, pastor resigns, retires, whatever, and then you have your pulpit committee get together and they start reviewing candidates and they say, okay, we've interviewed this candidate, you're going to get to hear him preach, and then we love your input, we'll let you know what we decide to do after he's been here. Well, then you know what kind of polity you have. You have a Presbyterian polity, okay? Elder rule. If you have a situation where someone is coming in and they're being evaluated, and you could say being vetted by a pulpit committee, but then they come, they preach, and they spend time with the congregation. The congregation asks them all these questions, and then they have a business meeting where they hash out, do we want to call this guy or not? And then there's a vote, and every person's vote matters. It counts. It determines whether the person's coming or not. That's congregational polity. So how you handle appointing deacons and how you handle appointing pastor, elders, that demonstrates the kind of polity that you have. The second thing we did, and we kind of flushed this out when we look at how the scriptures lay this out. We see the first example of deacons in Acts chapter 6. What does Peter say? He says, here's the criteria. We have this criteria because as the apostles, we know this is what God wants. And now you choose out from amongst yourselves people who meet these criteria, and then you bring them to us, and then there'll be a formal appointment. And the word we could indicate we, the apostles, appoint them, or we, the apostles, and the congregation together appoint them. It's probably more of the second, okay, because the congregation's involved. But what we saw in that is the involvement of the congregation. And then when we went to the examples of Ephesus and Crete, we saw that Paul is giving instruction to Titus, and he's giving instruction to Timothy, and based on the criteria, they're supposed to make an evaluation about who is appointed to ministry. And we also emphasize that these are people who are already in the church, who have a desire, they meet the biblical qualifications, and those qualifications have been given by the apostles themselves. So we looked at that issue of how a church appoints pastors, deacons. What you can see is that the congregation is doing this in what I would say is a congregational manner, and it's under the authority of Scripture through the apostles, and they are making the decision as individual congregations. Paul didn't say, here's your list, appoint these men. That's not what he did. He said, here are the qualifications. Appoint men from those congregations. And these are the people that know them. By the way, the people that appoint them are the ones that know them, and they're the ones that are going to have to live with them. Okay? You call a pastor, and you voted on that individual. You said, yes, I believe this is who God's supposed to pastor this congregation. But then when you have no say in it, in the back of your mind, you're going, I don't know if I really think this is a great idea. And when you're in that situation, all of a sudden, you start seeing where your true polity lies. Okay. All right. The next comment that I wanted to dig into, the summary is that the apostles gave specific instructions regarding the appointment of pastors and deacons. The church was responsible to evaluate and formally appoint those who had both the desire and met the qualifications laid out in Scripture. And pastors are overseers, meaning that they have responsibility and God-given authority to oversee the congregation. The congregation, not just pastors, should be involved in the process. Do you see that in these verses? The congregation shouldn't just be checked out. And by the way, if a congregation is going to be involved in the business of the church, they've got to be saved and they've got to be godly people. Okay? This is why in a Baptist church where we have congregational polity, it is so critical that we make sure a person has a genuine profession of faith when they join the church. Obviously, they need to be baptized. And number two, and they agree with the church's doctrine because this is what we believe and practice. And then number two, these are godly people. It's always interesting to me in a congregational meeting where we get into a discussion about something that people in the congregation have no information. They don't understand. Okay? And that's one of the negatives, one of the weaknesses. Okay, like let's say we're talking about a construction project. There are people in the church that's their thing. There's other people in the church that don't know anything about construction, so they're kind of trusting the judgment of those who are in those roles. But they're there as a protection to say something seems wrong about the way this process is going. Congregation should have a say in that. Okay. All right, any questions there before we start getting into this a little bit further? Yeah, go ahead.
Acts 15, the big controversy.
Yes.
There's the apostles, elders, and the whole church.
Yes.
Of course, apostles will depart from the scene in the very near future.
Yes.
So it needs a church with the elders and
Yes, good. Yeah, good example. Good example. Now, I think the next two examples that we're going to look at, I think are even, well, the last one is going to be the one that I think is the clearest of all. But the second one is giving. There are two key scriptures that I want to draw your attention to on this point. The first one is 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 9 to 14. Here's what it says. It is written in the law of Moses that thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care of oxen, or saith he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope should be partakers of this hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, it is great things if we shall reap your carnal, your physical things. If others be partakers of this power over you and are not, we rather. Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple? And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So, Paul is looking at several Old Testament examples. He's talking about the priesthood, and he says, how were the priests taken care of? Well, they didn't have their own inheritance. They weren't taken care of the way that the rest of the nation was. They lived off of the tithes and offerings of the people. Okay? So God ordained that the priesthood was going to eat and survive and take care of their families based on the giving of the nation, because they were benefiting from the function of that office in the most important way. Spiritually speaking, they were. And he uses the example of the ox. He says, you're benefiting from this animal that's doing work, and you need to take care of this animal doing work. So the point that he's trying to make is that the church who benefits from the teaching and the ministry is who's responsible to take care of the one doing it. So in principle, you'd have to conclude that in Paul's mind, it would make no sense for a church to be supporting another church's pastor when they have the capability to do it, because they're not benefiting from it. That church is, so it's their responsibility to do this. In the same way that the Apostle Paul, when he talks about widows indeed, he says, if they have children, then their children need to take care of their parents. What's he saying? He says, it's not the church's responsibility to take their responsibility away from them. They need to honor their parents, but if that person does not have children, guess what? Then the church is supposed to do this because that person is vulnerable and they don't have that. So the principle in our mind is that a church is responsible to take care of its own. That's what it should do. And so if a church is not doing that, either one, they're so weak and immature that they're not able to do this, or number two, they're being just flatly disobedient, okay? And in the early stages of a church getting established, it can most certainly be in that first category. It's weak, it's immature, and we would expect it to be weak and immature because it's not been around long enough. Like, nobody gets upset when, a toddler is being taken care of by mom and dad. But when that toddler's, 25 and still being treated like they're a toddler, then we start going, it's time to grow up. It's time to, spread your wings and fly, for crying out loud. You're not a little kid anymore. And so you get that concept. But it's even more explicitly stated in the next scripture that I want to draw your attention to, and that's 2 Corinthians 11, verse number 8. Paul writes, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. That's an amazing statement. I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. Now, do you get the impression that Paul believed that the way that the church of Corinth was relating to his ministry was wrong? I'd say if he says he robbed them, he's saying, I took something from them that they should not have had to give to you. That's what he's saying. Now, what is a little ironic about the passage is that when Paul talks about the church of Corinth, I think it's in the 1 Corinthians passage, I have to look back, not the second, but he says, I did not take from you because I knew how you would approach this issue. And so there were things about the Corinthian culture where there was a lot of patronizing and things like that, where it was almost like, if we give you money, we own you, and you do what we want. I mean, it's sort of like our political system today. So you have politicians who are making the weirdest of decisions, and you say, why are they making these odd decisions? And he's like, well, who's funding them? That's why they're doing what they're doing. It's patronizing, okay? So if you pay me this, I'm going to give you this back. It's my way of showing you I care. Such a principled way of living, right? Well, that was going on in Corinth. It was a part of their culture. It was, politics was a huge problem in the Corinthian culture, and that was in the church as well. And so Paul said, rather than having you have this mindset that is so worldly and so detrimental, I'm not going to take a penny from you, and I'm going to minister to you, and I'm going to let somebody else take care of me. Or I'm going to do it with my own hands. But there comes a point where he goes, it's time for you to recognize it's not their responsibility anymore, it's yours. That's what he's saying. So what that's telling you is that the church is responsible to take care of itself. Now, this is about missions. I don't know of a lot of churches in the States that the salary of their pastor is being paid by another church. Maybe if they're a church planter, okay, but an established church where a pastor or a congregation outside of that is paying for their pastor, I don't know of too many situations like that. But that is not unusual in the mission field. Not at all. Not at all. And this is a huge problem, okay? Sometimes we get in our minds that, that is a developing country, which means that the people don't make a lot of money when they're working, a lot of people are unemployed, and so let's just be kind and benevolent, and let's just take care of their pastor for them. But the question is, how many people does it take to support a pastor? I mean, if somebody's giving 10% of their income to God, then it takes 10 giving families to support a pastor. That might be 20 people. Do you realize that? That could be 20 people. Maybe 30 people, if they have some kids and things like that. Or maybe some of them are singles. But the point is, if you have 30 to 50 people and people actually have a conviction about giving, they can support their pastor. He can be supported at a level that we could say is kind of the median range of those people's incomes. That's really what you're talking about. And I know I know that there's some nuance there. I understand that, you got to meet somewhere. There's costs involved with that, and there's startup. I get all that, but the point I'm trying to say is this: sometimes we get in our minds that people are incapable of doing something that they are not just capable of; they're responsible for. And guess what? In our culture, we call it hover parenting. We do it on the mission field. Like, you got to make every decision for Johnny. Well, guess what? Johnny's never going to learn how to be a man if you do this. And then one of these days, he's going to get mad at you because you treat him like a kid when he's an adult, but he thinks like a kid and he acts like a kid. And you know why he thinks and acts like a kid? Because that's what you made him. That's the bottom line. And so when it comes to this issue of giving, when we send a missionary, we want the missionary to start from the beginning to establish in the people's minds, you need to be an independent church who takes care of your pastor, who's taking care of your needs. And we can certainly help a church in those early stages, just like, when I went to college, my parents helped me with college. They didn't have to do that, but they did that. That was a really nice thing of them to do. But they're not paying my bills today. There was a day they didn't pay for my postgraduate work. Why? You're on your own. It's your time to fly, yo, man. Go do it, all right? So the idea is that we have to put this in the minds of people early on. They have to be thinking, we want to be an independent church. We're going to take care of ourselves. We're not going to be dependent and, we could say, ignore our responsibility as a church. Very, very important. So, I'll summarize it this way. The church was responsible to financially support itself. In the initial stages, when it is immature, it may not be able to fully support its pastor, but that should be its goal. And again, I have no problem with someone being bivocational, but being bivocational is challenging in ministry. And there comes a point where it becomes detrimental. And, there's certain situations, like when we were missionaries, the two pastors that are pastoring in the church in Ghana, they are bivocational guys. Okay? However, their work loads and their schedules and all that is very different than the way that people work here in the States. It's just very different. I mean, if you work in D.C., you spend like an hour and a half, 2 hours on the road every day, plus the hours that you're in the office or whatever you're doing. And it's very, very demanding on the schedule. And whereas a person who has a job with some flexibility, that they have their own business or something like that, they can choose the hours that they work. There are certain jobs that would work very, very well. And so, some flexibility is important. But the point is, the church is taking care of their pastor, and they're not dependent on outside funding. But you see how this is, it really shows you how the church is organized, how they handle this issue of giving. All right. Any questions or comments on that one before I move to the third one?
The point, you mentioned the 20, just say 20 people give 10%, right?
Yep.
Okay, so you're talking about it, the culture around it or whatever, right?
Yep.
20 people give 10%. Okay, that's considered the tithe, right?
Yep.
Okay, so just curiosity, is that sound, or should the tithe go to supporting the pastor, or should that be a separate giving to support the pastor? And, yeah.
So that's an interesting question. So the way that the New Testament lays this issue out is that the primary responsibility of the church is to support those who minister in the word, okay? And then there are secondary issues as well. Like we could say if you have widows indeed, you're to financially support those individuals. And obviously, if the church is going to have to figure out how it's going to meet in a place. So if the church was small and a person had a very large home, they could meet. I mean, when we talk about somebody like Lydia, okay? She was a wealthy person. She was a businesswoman. She probably lived in a very large home. The church met in her house. Okay? Aquila and Priscilla, the church met in their house. And when you say the church met in their house, don't think of like this teeny little room they're all like sitting in. I mean, like, if these people were wealthy people, they had large homes and they could meet in those locations. They maybe would have to rent a hall or something like that. I mean, they found places to meet based on the situation that was there, and that may have left them with some financial situation as well. But what I would say is that the responsibility of the church is to give to support what is absolutely laid out in Scripture, and then these other secondary issues, you make judgments about those based on the situation. So like when we talk about missions, that's kind of a secondary issue. It's something we should be doing. Like in our church, we would say that your general fund giving, we use the term tithes and offerings, but really what's happening is people that have a conviction about giving on a monthly basis or biweekly or whatever their pay salary situation is, they give to the general fund for the support of the church, and then they say, okay, I also want to support missions, so I give this amount. Okay? But missions is it's outside of the church. It's an overflow. It's almost like if we were to look at the Old Testament principle, we would say it's like a free will offering. Or let's say that we have a special project. There's a church in great need. They need a new roof, or we'll take up a special offering, maybe at Christmas or Sacrificial Sunday or something like that. That would be, us saying from the abundance we want to give and be a blessing to those individuals. And we have examples of that in the New Testament. Like the church at Jerusalem. I mean, when the church at Jerusalem, when people sold everything and they put it all together, we're talking about people who are like totally destitute, and they're like, we're going to have to support these people because they've lost their jobs, they're isolated from their families, they're experiencing great hardship, we're helping them out. Or when there was a famine in Jerusalem, they were looking out for them. Most certainly when Jerusalem was destroyed, the Christian church would have experienced hardship. Those survived because they were not identifying with Judaism. They weren't a part of the sacrificial system and all those kinds of things. But they would have experienced hardship, and churches would have wanted to help them out. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess meaning it's okay for that tithe to support the pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that's what it's for. That's what I'd say it's for. In the same way that Levitical tithe would have been to support the Levites. But there were also parts of the Levitical tithe that were for their festive occasions and things like that. But they actually had multiple tithes in their Levitical system. Because you have to think this is a government structure where it's a theocracy. So you had supporting the Levites, you had festive occasions, and then you had supporting strangers and fatherless and widows, people that were poor and destitute. So they had secondary ones for that as well. Good question. All right, the next one we're going to get into is, I think, to me, it's the clearest of all three of them. Not the other ones aren't clear, but that is how you handle church discipline. And this is a topic that is very important for us to think about. Several important scriptures. The first one is Matthew 18, 15 to 17. This is Christ teaching on sins that disrupt the unity of a body of believers. It says, if thy brother trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take 2 or 3 more witnesses, that in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. If he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. If he neglect to hear the church, let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican. Question. Whose responsibility is it to address issues between brothers? The 2 people involved. Okay? Now, hey, I've had people come to me before with issues, and they're like, hey, how do I go and talk to this person? No problem. I got no issue with that. Actually, I really want them to do that, to be totally honest with you. I'd rather somebody get some input on how to approach someone who they have an issue with, rather than to just go and do it and blow it up, okay? And then sometimes I have people that come to me and they're like, can you go to this person for me? Now, in those situations, I may or may not do it. It really depends on the situation. In a lot of the situations, I would say, well, I didn't see the situation. I wasn't involved in it. You need to go talk to them yourself. Now, what they do is, a person is inclined to do is, they don't want to have this confrontation, so they want somebody else to do it for them. But that's not what the Bible teaches. It says, if your brother trespasses against you, then you go and tell them alone. Now, the whole point is that when there's sin that disrupts relationship, you want to keep it small and isolated. You don't want your dispute with another person to blow up the whole church. You want to resolve it as small as possible. Now, when that person did not receive it, and there could be a lot of reasons why they didn't receive it. One might be because they're just hard-hearted, okay? One might be because you didn't really approach them very well. and one might be just a communication issue, okay? There's a couple different scenarios. So in the next phase, he goes, if he doesn't hear you, then take 2 or 3 more. And he says that every word may be established. Now, this is important. Does he say, take it to your pastor at this point? Now, again, you can. He could be one of those people. But a lot of times, when there's a conflict between people and you pull the pastor into it, immediately just raises the level of the contention. It's like, oh, you got an issue with me, and now you're going to bring my pastor in. And you're going to badmouth me to this person, and now it's going to be this big issue. So, honestly, it is helpful to not even get it to that level where you take it to leadership sometimes in these situations. Now, again, there are situations where you have to do that. But you need godly people involved. And the point is that when you come and you sit down with a person you have an issue with, all of a sudden, these people are evaluating a lot of different things. They're evaluating, number one, what is said. They're evaluating how it's said. They're evaluating the responses on both sides. They're making a judgment about whether or not one person's view needs to be corrected. The truth is that when I've been in situations like this, there have been times that the person who was the initiator of let's get this thing resolved, that person needed to actually be brought in line. Not always, but sometimes. Sometimes they're the aggressor, but they're actually the one who's creating the problem. Sometimes it's the other person. Sometimes it's a combination of both. But it's to establish some objectivity to this situation so that it can be brought into control. But even at times, when you have that, you can't resolve it. So then what are you supposed to do? If he neglects to hear them, tell it unto who? The church. Interesting. He doesn't say tell it to the pastor, the elders, the deacons. Tell it to the church. What that's telling you is that this issue is not just the pastor kicked somebody out of the church. I mean, it happens, you know. So, somebody crosses, you know, the pastor too many times, and they get into this discussion, and it gets a little bit heated, and he finally just says, you know, there's a back door right there if you'd like to take it. That's not church discipline. That's abuse of authority. Okay? That's what that is. And so the point is that you take it to the body, not just 1 or 2 people, the whole congregation. And this is important. It shows you the congregational aspect of this. And when a church has been taught well and has mature people, the pastor doesn't have to get involved in all these situations. Someone in church leadership doesn't have to get involved in all these situations. When a church is very immature, doesn't have godly people, well, pastors and deacons have to be doing all this stuff because they're the only people that have the grace and the sense to handle it the right way. And so one of the things that shows you the maturity level of a church is, can people resolve these issues on their own without having to get the leadership involved? But the point that I really want to draw your attention to is he says take it to the church. Not the elders, the church. In other words, that person or those people don't sit in front of 3 or 4 people. They make a decision and, all right, you're gone. They go to the congregation. Paul instructs the church at Corinth. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he says, "It is reported commonly that there is fornication among you, such fornication that is not even named amongst the Gentiles." He says, "I wrote in an epistle not to company with fornicators. Now I've written unto you not to keep company, if any man is called a brother, and he be a fornicator, or covetous, or idolater, or railer, drunkard, or an extortioner, with such a one not to eat." So the question is, who did Paul write the book of 1 Corinthians to? He wrote to the church. The answer is right here, 1 Corinthians 1:1. "Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, through the will of God, and Sosthenes our brother, unto the church of God, which is at Corinth." He wrote to the church. In 2 Corinthians, we see the follow-up to, it appears, this situation. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 6, he says, "Sufficient to such a man is this punishment, which was inflicted of many. So that contrary, you ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. Wherefore I beseech you that ye should confirm your love toward him." Again, who did Paul write this to? Well, it says in 2 Corinthians 1:1, "Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Timothy our brother, unto the church of God." So, what that tells you is that this situation wasn't just for leadership. It's for everybody. The whole congregation was to take action as a body and to do that. To me, this shows you both the autonomy of the local church and that the polity involves congregational involvement. It's not just a bishop over a bunch of churches. He comes in and he deals with this. Or it's not just a couple of elders in the church. They make all the decisions. Who's in, who's out, why they're out, all that kind of stuff. The congregation has to be involved in these things. And so, church discipline does not necessarily need to start with church leadership. Again, please understand something. If you're ever in a situation where you feel like you need to get into this with somebody, don't hesitate to come to me. Don't feel like I'm telling you can't do that, okay? Please don't feel that way. But what I am saying is, you don't have to come to me. You don't have to come to Pastor Josh. You don't have to come to a deacon. You could go to a godly individual in the church who you know walks with God, has good sense, and say, "I've tried to work this out with my brother. Would you be willing to come and try to help us work this out?" That's a really good and healthy thing when a church has that. Number 2, it is the individual's responsibility to follow God's instruction and to take it to the church when appropriate and necessary. Now, in a church scenario, sometimes pastor finds out something's going on, a deacon finds out something's going on, we'll have a meeting, and then I got to go have a conversation with somebody. It happens, all right? Sadly but truthfully. But the fact is that that's not the best way for something to start. It's not the only way for it to start. It's best to deal with it on the individual level. Try to involve as few people as possible if that is unnecessary to go to that level. Very important. Next, the church, not just the leadership, is responsible to relate properly to those under discipline. So, it's not just, okay, here's how I'm going to deal with it. Y'all do your own thing. We as a body have a responsibility in how we relate to people in these situations. So, here are my concluding thoughts, but I'm going to wait to see if there are any questions. Any questions out here? Yeah, go ahead. I see some. Yeah, go ahead.
Logistically, like if you take it to the church, if
Yes.
you get to that step, does that mean a business meeting? Does that mean you go individually to all the people?
Well, we've done this before. So,
Okay, yeah.
a lot of times when I've had to deal with this before, what I've done is on a Sunday night, when it has to go to that level, I've said something to the effect of, after the service, we need to have a brief meeting of the members. And then I've had, and actually since I've been here, I've only had one situation where I've had to do that. But there's,
I remember now, that's the only one
Yeah.
I've ever seen. Just
yeah,
curious.
we've had to do that before, so. Yeah, and what I have to do in a situation like that is I have to give some background. I'm not gonna get into all the details of the situation, but I have to give enough information that people understand. Here was the process we went through. Here are the most serious matters that we've tried to address and how it was handled. And that's what we do. When we were in Ghana, we had to do this twice as well. But I think there it was a smaller congregation at the time, so we, all 15 to 20 of us was at that stage in the church. It was very small group of people, maybe 20 people. So that's what we did. All right, and I could open it up to questions depending on what it is, or I might encourage people just to come to me individually. But I'm going to make a judgment based on whether or not I think people are going to need to ask more questions, or if it's something that's like, if somebody's having an affair and we've confronted them, like people don't need to ask a bunch of questions about that, But if we had a situation where somebody had abused somebody in the church, I'd have to address that to a greater extent than just, we had an issue and people have kids in the church. They want to know what happened here, and so we'd have to go into further detail. And in a situation like that, I would have conversations with the men before we even got in that meeting on some things that we might need to say. So. There was one back here. Yeah.
Do you find a lot of times it's more the attitude of the people than necessarily the action that they did?
Absolutely, 100%. So, even in a situation where a person has committed adultery, that may not necessarily go to the church depending on some of the circumstances involved. Okay? How the person has responded, how the person's spouse has responded. There are certain aspects to that. And there are some situations that it wouldn't have had to go to the church, but because of the way it was responded to, it will. There are times that it will be dealt with entirely internally. And there's situations, in counseling where in the back of your mind, this has the potential to become church discipline a year from now. And you're working with this person, but sometimes you have a situation where someone's like, I'm getting accountability, but they're playing a game, and you start realizing that. So when you start establishing some boundaries and some real accountability, that they're constantly bucking it, and then you have to draw a line and say, okay, you cross this line here, and this is what we're going to have to do, because you're demonstrating you don't care, So there's a lot of different situations, and they get flushed out pretty thoroughly. But there are serious things that people do sometimes, and they're very broken about it, and the only people that are aware of it and that are really affected by it is them and maybe their spouse, something like that. And in some of these situations, it's not going to go beyond that. If it's a legal thing, it's going to go to law enforcement. And if law enforcement presses charges on a person because of something that happened, well, then that's going to have to be disclosed to the church, because that's going to be a public issue. So there's things like that too. Very delicate how these things are. And whenever we've dealt with a person where you had to confront them, we always tried to do it as graciously as possible to give them as much opportunity to respond the right way. So when I've dealt with people that truly blew it off, I have a completely clear conscience on it, because I give them more than enough opportunity to not respond like that. I mean, we go above and beyond when we are in these situations. It's not a quick thing like, we had one meeting, this person blew up, and then, I'm taking this to the church tomorrow. I mean, it isn't like that at all. We are very, very patient with people. Maybe more so than we should be sometimes. But I would rather be clear in my conscience that we did not go overboard on this than to rush to judgment. All right, so concluding thoughts. Church plants. The scriptures define the kind of people that we should send out. They define the kinds of churches we should seek to plant. And so I just jotted some things down. Biblical in doctrine, gospel clarity, submission to the authority of Scripture. Biblical in practice, self-governing, choosing its own leadership, maintaining purity in the congregation. Whoops. Self-supported, financially, it is supporting its own leadership, and self-propagating, it's growing so that it can send out from its own congregation. When we talk about church planting, that's what we want. Sound doctrine, sound practice. There are churches that their doctrinal statement's great. What they say on paper is great. But the actual doing of it is the problem, you know. And it's like a person who can write a book on parenting and their kids are going off the deep end, you know. It's like, you seem like you think you know what you're doing, and maybe what you're saying is true, but there's something in the home that's not going right, you know. And so we don't want to just be sound in our doctrine. We want to be sound in our practice too, how we're working through these things. So, any other questions before we close? All right, well, let's close in prayer.